Hey there, ready for an adventure?
An adventure!
Yeah, an adventure into the hidden workings of our own minds.
I like the sound of that.
Today's deep dive is all about cognitive biases,
Ah,
those sneaky mental shortcuts that can trip us up.
I'm intrigued.
We're using Rolf Dobelli's book, The Art of Thinking Clearly, as our guide.
Okay, I'm familiar with that one.
He unpacks these biases with real-world examples, and they're both fascinating, A&D a little unnerving.
I bet. The brain can be a mysterious place.
It really can. And the thing is, we're all susceptible to these biases.
Everyone.
Everyone, no matter how smart or self-aware we think we are.
That's a little unsettling, but I can see how that would be true.
Okay, let's jump into Dobelli's first theme. How do we perceive success?
And are we being fooled by what we see on the surface?
Exactly, like that story Dobelli tells about Rick, the aspiring screenwriter who moves to Los Angeles.
Oh yeah, Rick. He gets swept up in all the glitz and glamour of Hollywood.
He's surrounded by successful writers.
So he figures his chances of making it are pretty good.
But what Rick doesn't see are all the aspiring screenwriters who crashed and burned.
The ones who aren't hanging out at the same parties or giving interviews.
Exactly. So Rick's view of success is totally skewed by this survivorship bias.
Like looking at a forest and only seeing the tallest trees.
Yes. You miss all the saplings that didn't quite make it.
And this bias doesn't just apply to Hollywood. Think about any field where success is highly visible: authors, entrepreneurs, athletes. We only hear about the ones who made it,
Right. So it creates this illusion that success is more common than it actually is.
which can be very misleading.
This is making me rethink how I view success stories. Am I giving too much credit to talent or hard work?
When there might be other factors at play.
Yes, like we're seeing the full picture.
Or just a carefully curated highlight reel.
Okay, so we need to be more critical of how we define and measure success. But what about those times when we mistake correlation for causation?
Ah, yes. The swimmer's body illusion.
It's a great example of how we sometimes confuse cause and effect. We see these incredible athletes with their perfect physiques.
And assume that's because of all the training they do.
But as Dobelli points out, they're probably great swimmers because they have the right body type in the first place.
It's a selection factor, not a result of their training.
Right. Think about it this way. If you threw 1,000 random people into a pool and only selected the best swimmers.
They'd probably have similar body types.
Exactly. So, next time you see an ad promising amazing results, ask yourself, is this because of the product?
Or is there a pre-existing factor at play?
Okay, so we've talked about success and how we perceive it, but now let's dive into another area where our thinking can go awry: our relationship with probability.
Ooh, this is where things can get interesting.
It is, and honestly, this is where I get a little nervous because I'm terrible with probabilities. Like, I know the odds of winning the lottery are practically zero, but I still get sucked into the hype.
You and almost everyone else. We tend to respond more to the magnitude of an event than its actual likelihood,
I see. The bigger the potential win, the more appealing it seems.
even if the chances of winning are infinitesimally small.
That makes sense. Okay, so that explains my lottery obsession. But what about those times when we do think about probability?
But completely misinterpret it.
Yeah, like finding patterns where none exist.
That's the clustering illusion at work. Our brains are wired to find patterns, even if it means seeing things that aren't really there.
Our brains are like conspiracy theorists, always trying to connect the dots.
Exactly. Dobelli tells this rather captivating story about a Swedish opera singer, Fredrik Jorgensen, who thought he heard messages in birdsong.
Really? In birdsong?
Yeah, he even believed he could hear his deceased mother's voice.
Whoa, that's a bit unsettling, but I can see how our brains would do that, trying to find meaning and order in random events.
It's a survival mechanism gone haywire. In the past, recognizing patterns helped us avoid danger and find food. But nowadays...
It can lead us down all sorts of rabbit holes.
Exactly.
Like seeing the face of Jesus in a piece of toast.
Yeah,
Or thinking that wearing your lucky socks will help you win a poker game.
precisely. And then there's the opposite of this, the neglect of probability.
Where we completely downplay the likelihood of something happening, even when the odds are stacked against us.
Right.
Like assuming you'll never get into a car accident, even though statistically it's quite likely in a lifetime of driving.
And this can have some pretty serious consequences, especially when it comes to things like health and safety.
Right, we might avoid taking necessary precautions because we underestimate the risks.
Exactly. Now, Dobelli also talks about zero-risk bias.
Why would eliminating all risk be a bad thing?
Because it's often irrational, and it can lead to worse outcomes. He uses the example of water treatment methods. So you have two options. One reduces the risk of death from contaminated water by 3%, while the other eliminates the risk entirely.
Okay, so far so good.
But that second option is much more expensive and less effective overall.
So we'd be tempted to choose the zero risk option, even though it's not the most logical or beneficial choice in the long run.
Precisely. We get so fixated on eliminating all risk that we overlook the bigger picture.
And we end up making a less optimal decision.
It's like overpaying for insurance that you'll probably never need.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects. So how do we avoid these probability pitfalls?
By being more aware of how our emotions and gut feelings can cloud our judgment.
Easier said than done.
And by remembering that even though we might feel like we're in control, the truth is chance and randomness play a much bigger role in life than we'd like to admit.
That's a good point.
Hmm.
Okay, so we've talked about how we perceive success and our flawed relationship with probability.
Two biggies.
They are. But now let's shift gears and explore how other people influence our thinking.
This should be good.
It is, because I think we've all experienced this, especially in group settings, like you're at a concert and someone starts clapping.
And suddenly the whole room joins in, even if the performance wasn't that great.
Yes, that's the power of social proof at work. We look to others for cues on how to behave, even when those actions go against our better judgment.
It's a powerful force.
It really is. It's like that classic experiment where people stare up at the sky for no reason.
And passersby automatically do the same, just because they see others doing it.
Exactly. It highlights how easily we conform to the behavior of the group, even when it makes no logical sense. And this isn't just about clapping or staring at the sky.
Oh no, it goes much deeper than that.
It can affect our purchasing decisions, our political views, even our sense of morality.
It's almost scary how influential it can be.
This is making me rethink all those times I've bought something just because it was a bestseller or agreed with someone just because they sounded confident.
It's a natural human tendency to want to fit in and avoid standing out.
That's true. But it's important to be aware of this bias so that we can make more conscious choices.
Agreed.
Okay, so social proof can be a powerful influencer. But what about the influence of authority figures?
Ah, yes. Dobelli calls this authority bias. It seems like we're hardwired to trust people in positions of power.
Even when they haven't earned our trust.
Right. It's almost as if we hand over our critical thinking skills the moment someone puts on a uniform or a suit and tie. Dobelli points out how economists, for example, failed to predict the 2008 financial crash.
And yet we still listen to their forecasts as if they have some special insight into the future.
It's strange, isn't it?
It is. And think about all the harmful medical practices throughout history that were endorsed by doctors simply because they were seen as authorities. Bloodletting anyone.
It's a stark reminder that we should always question authority, no matter how impressive their credentials may seem.
So instead of blindly following the crowd or deferring to experts, we need to think for ourselves and evaluate the evidence. Easier said than done, right?
It takes effort and courage to go against the grain, but the rewards of critical thinking are well worth it. Now, are you ready to explore how our own minds can trick us?
Bring it on. Let's expose those inner saboteurs.
Okay, let's start with one of the most pervasive biases, confirmation bias. This is the tendency to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs.
And ignore anything that contradicts them.
Exactly. Dobelli gives the example of people who believe that people are inherently good.
Or people are inherently bad.
They'll find evidence to support their view every day.
Even though it's a gross oversimplification of human nature.
Right. And it's not just about our beliefs about people either. It can apply to anything. Politics, religion, even our investment choices.
It's like we're wearing blinders that only allow us to see what we want to see.
We cling to evidence that supports our decisions, even when it's clear we've made a mistake.
It takes a great deal of humility and intellectual honesty to acknowledge when we're wrong.
You know, Warren Buffett, the renowned investor, put it perfectly when he said, what the human being is best at doing is interpreting all new information so that their prior conclusions remain intact.
That's a powerful quote.
Right.
So how do we break free from this echo chamber of our own making?
By actively seeking out different perspectives.
By challenging our own assumptions.
And by being willing to change our minds when presented with compelling evidence.
It's about embracing intellectual humility, which is a lot harder than it sounds. Okay, before we move on to the next bias, I have a confession to make. I am a sucker for a good story, even if it means bending the facts a little.
Ah, yes, the story bias. Our brains crave narratives, even if they distort
I
reality.
know, I know. It's a weakness.
We all have them. Dobelli illustrates this with a clever example using two stories by E.M. Forster. The first simply states, "The king died and the queen died." The second one adds, "The king died and the queen died of grief."
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Which story are you more likely to remember?
Definitely the second one. It has an emotional hook, a cause and effect that our brains can latch on to.
It's the same reason why advertisers use storytelling in their marketing campaigns. They know that a good story can make a product more memorable and appealing.
Even if the story has nothing to do with the product's actual benefits. It makes me think about that Google Super Bowl commercial from 2010, Google Parisian Love. It was a beautifully crafted story, but it didn't really tell us anything about Google's products.
Precisely. It was a masterclass in using storytelling to evoke an emotional response. And this bias doesn't just affect how we consume advertising.
It shapes how we understand the world around us,
Yes, we impose narratives on everything.
even when it distorts reality.
So, how do we avoid being seduced by a good story?
I'm all ears.
By remembering that reality is often much more complex and nuanced than any story we can come up with, and by being willing to separate the facts from the fiction.
It's like that saying, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Except, we should be doing the opposite, right? Okay, enough about stories. Let's talk about how our memories can play tricks on us, especially when we look back at past events.
You're talking about hindsight bias, right? The classic "I knew it all along"
Yeah.
phenomenon.
Yes, after something happens, it suddenly seems predictable.
Even though it wasn't at the time?
Exactly.
Dobelli gives the example of the 2008 market crash. In hindsight, all the causes seem painfully obvious, but very few experts actually predicted it beforehand.
Like when you hear about a couple getting divorced.
And suddenly, everyone remembers all the signs that the relationship was doomed.
Yes, we rewrite history in our minds to fit the outcome, which can be a dangerous thing.
Dangerous. How so?
Because it gives us a false sense of certainty about the past, which can lead to overconfidence in our ability to predict the future.
That's a good point. So how do we counter this bias?
I'm not sure. How do we counter it?
By being more humble about our ability to predict events, and by acknowledging that we often don't know as much as we think we do.
Okay, enough about the past. Let's talk about the present and how we often overestimate our own abilities.
Ah, yes, the overconfidence effect. This one could be a real doozy.
I bet. Dobelli has some great examples of how this plays out.
And like what?
Well, for example, in one study, people were asked to estimate the total egg production in the U.S. or the number of doctors in Boston. They could choose any range they liked, aiming to be right 98% of the time. They were wrong 40% of the time.
Really?
It shows just how much we tend to overestimate our knowledge and abilities.
Wow.
And it gets even funnier when you look at the example of Frenchmen. In surveys, 84% of them claim to be above average lovers.
Which is statistically impossible, unless Frenchmen have a very different understanding of what average means.
So overconfidence makes us think we're better than we actually are, and that can lead to some bad decisions, right?
Absolutely. Risky investments, failed projects, even relationship problems.
Because we might take on more than we can handle.
Or make promises we can't keep.
So how do we avoid this trap?
By being more realistic about our limitations, by seeking out feedback from others, and by being willing to admit when we're wrong.
Easier said than done, but definitely something to strive for.
Okay, one last bias before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
What is it? The introspection illusion.
Ah, yes. This is the belief that self-reflection leads to truth.
But that's not always the case, right? We can be pretty good at fooling ourselves.
Exactly. Dobelli shares a study where participants were asked to choose between two portraits.
Okay, I'm following.
Then describe what they found attractive about their choice. But the researchers sneakily switched the photos.
Wait, so they were describing a completely different photo?
Exactly, and most people didn't even notice the switch.
Wow, that's wild.
Our brains are basically making up stories to justify our choices, even when those choices were never really made.
So our self-perceptions are often biased and unreliable.
It seems so.
This is making me question everything I thought I knew about myself. So what's the takeaway here? How do we avoid falling for this illusion?
By being more skeptical of our own introspection, by realizing that our self-perceptions are often based on faulty memories and self-serving biases, and by being open to the possibility that we might not know ourselves as well as we think we do.
Phew, that's a lot to process. It seems like our brains are working against us at every turn.
Not necessarily. These biases are just part of how our minds work. The key is to be aware of them.
So that we can make more conscious choices.
Exactly. Welcome back. Are you ready to dive back in?
I am. Where are we headed next?
Decision making. There's this thing called a sunk cost fallacy, and I think we've all been there.
Okay, yeah, I think I've heard of that one. It's about getting stuck in the past.
Yes, throwing good money after bad.
Just because we've already invested so much.
Exactly. Like watching a terrible movie.
Oh, yeah, because you already bought the ticket.
Right. Or how about staying in a job you hate?
Or a relationship that's clearly not working.
Because you've already invested so much time and energy.
Classic sunk cost fallacy. So how do we break free?
Well, you have to remember that sunk costs are sunk.
Meaning?
They're gone. It's about what's the best decision now, moving forward.
Don't dwell on the past.
Exactly. It's like driving with your eyes fixed on the rearview mirror.
Okay, that's a great analogy. So next time I find myself clinging to a project or a job that's clearly not working.
Ask yourself,
Oh,
would I make the same decision today? Starting from scratch.
that's a good one. I'm going to write that down.
Do it. Okay, ready to shift gears?
Sure, what's next?
Choice. Sometimes we have too many.
Ooh, the paradox of choice.
That's it. We think more choice equals more freedom, but
But it can actually lead to paralysis.
and regret. Dobelli uses that example about his sister agonizing over bathroom tiles.
Oh, yeah, I remember that story. Too many options.
And even when we do choose, we wonder if we made the right choice.
It's like buyer's remorse.
But amplified. Remember that jam sampling experiment?
Oh, remind me.
They had a display with either 6 or 24 varieties of jam.
Okay, and
People who saw the smaller selection were more likely to buy a jar.
interesting. The ones with more choices were just overwhelmed.
Exactly. Too many tabs open in your brain.
So how do we deal with this?
Simplify. Set clear criteria.
Except that there's no such thing as the perfect choice.
Exactly. And sometimes, just go with your gut.
I can do that.
Now, are you ready for some heavier stuff?
Bring it on.
Okay, this is about thinking errors with consequences.
This is where it gets real, huh?
Right. Like false causality. Mistaking correlation for causation.
Yeah, like ice cream sales and shark attacks.
Yes. Just because two things happen at the same time.
Doesn't mean one caused the other.
Exactly. Dobelli uses firefighters and fire damage. More firefighters, more damage.
Right. But the bigger fires need more firefighters.
We jump to conclusions about cause and effect.
Sometimes it's just a coincidence.
Or a hidden factor. Oh, and remember the storks?
Sporks.
Birth rates and stork pairs in Germany both declining.
Hilarious. But obviously not related.
Okay, next hazard.
Let's hear it.
The gambler's fallacy. The belief that past events can influence the future.
Even when it's random.
Yes, like the roulette table at Monte Carlo. The ball landed on black 26 times in a row.
I can only imagine the bets people were making.
Thinking red was due, but the ball has no memory.
It's like the universe has to even things out.
It's tempting to think that way, but
Not how it works.
random is random.
Okay, got it. What else?
Last one. The because justification.
Tell me more.
It's about how easily we're persuaded by any reason at all.
Really? Any reason.
Think about cutting in line at a copy machine.
If you say, because I'm in a hurry,
Yep, people are more likely to let you cut, even if the reason makes no sense.
the word because is powerful.
It is.
Even when it's followed by nonsense.
It shows how easily we're swayed. So,
We need to demand evidence, not just because.
this has been quite a journey.
So many ways our brains can trick us. But knowing about them is the first step, right?
Absolutely. Awareness is key.
Back again for more brain-mending fun.
Ready to wrap up our deep dive into cognitive biases.
Definitely. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface.
Oh, there are plenty more where those came from, but let's focus on a few more that are particularly impactful.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, let's talk about the halo effect.
I think I've heard of that one. It's about first impressions, right?
Sort of. It's broader than that. It's how one positive trait can influence our whole perception.
Of a person? Or a company?
Both. Like, think back to the dot-com boom.
Oh, boy.
Remember Cisco?
Really?
Everyone raved about their customer service, their brilliant CEO.
The media loved them.
But then the bubble burst and
All that shine disappeared.
the halo effect can work in reverse, too. Bad reputation.
We see everything they do with suspicion.
Even if they're doing good things.
It's like we're wearing those rose-colored glasses.
Or the opposite.
Makes sense. So how do we avoid this halo effect? Make sure we're judging things fairly?
Be aware of it, for one.
Okay, good advice. But practically speaking,
Focus on the facts, not just your gut feeling.
And maybe get some other perspectives.
Exactly. World-class orchestras
Yeah.
for auditions.
Yeah.
Candidates play behind a screen.
So the judges can't see them.
They only judge the music.
Wow, that's smart. Eliminates any bias.
Now, ready for a bias that messes with how we see our own choices.
Oh, lay it on me.
It's called alternative paths.
Alternative paths.
It's about how we feel about our successes and failures.
Okay, go on.
Dobelli uses this thought experiment. It involves Russian roulette.
Whoa, okay, this is getting intense.
Imagine you play, you win, you get $10 million.
Well, that escalated quickly.
You're ecstatic, but then you compare yourself to some lawyer working hard but never going to be that rich.
So you feel superior.
But you're only seeing your outcome. What if you'd lost the roulette?
Oh, right. Bad things could have happened.
Or the lawyer wins the lottery next week?
We forget about all the other possibilities.
It distorts our thinking. We get too proud or too ashamed.
One really.
It's all chance. There were other paths we could have been on.
It's like looking at one frame of a movie.
And missing the whole film. Good point.
So focus on the present. Let go of the what-ifs. What else you got?
How about the news? Ever feel overwhelmed by predictions?
Oh, all the time. Politics, the economy, the weather. Everyone's predicting something.
Right, it's the forecast delusion. We think these experts know what's coming.
But do they?
Well, there was this study, tracked 28,000 predictions over 10 years.
Okay.
They were barely more accurate than random guesses.
Seriously. So all those talking heads?
Just making stuff up. Pretty much. We crave certainty, so we listen. But no one has a crystal ball.
So be skeptical. Don't just blindly believe the hype.
Remember, the future is shaped by us, too. Okay, ready for our final bias? This one's a real brain twister.
Hit me.
The conjunction fallacy. We think specific things are more probable than general ones.
How does that even work?
Deliwa describes this woman, Linda, very intelligent, social justice activist, that kind of thing.
I'm picturing her.
Danny asks, is it more likely Linda's a bank teller or a bank teller and a feminist?
Well, the second one fits her description better.
But it's logically impossible. A bank teller is the broader category.
Oh, right. Adding more details makes it less likely.
We get fooled by this story.
Yeah.
Our brains love those.
So this whole deep dive, it's like a warning label for our own minds.
I like that. Use it wisely.
So many traps we can fall into. But we've learned so much. I feel like I can spot these biases everywhere now.
That's the first step to overcoming them. And thanks to Dobelli's book, we have some powerful tools to think more clearly.
It's been an incredible journey. So to our listeners, keep questioning, keep learning, and never underestimate the power of your own mind.
And its quirks. Thanks for joining us.